Good evening and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm sorry we're recording tonight. It's just this was the only way we could get this one done, and this show is too important not to do. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and today I will be talking with Walker Bragman, independent journalist, who has done a lot of really great work on the funding of COVID denial, be it the Great Barrington Declaration or more recently the Brownstone Institute. Good evening, Walker. Good evening, Walker. How are you doing?
Not bad. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. When I read that piece on the Brownstone Institute, I was like, yeah, we got to talk about this. Yeah, so first, just who are the Brownstone Institute? Let's start there for people who haven't heard of them.
So the Brownstone Institute is a dark money group founded in 2021, I believe May 2021, by a guy named Jeffrey Tucker. Now, Tucker is an interesting character. We can get to him, but Brownstone is it arose out of the Great Barrington Declaration, which, for those who don't know, is an open letter from October 2020 that called on governments to embrace mass infection as a path to herd immunity, implement only what they called focused protection, which is like sort of cover your ass language for doing nothing, and then let the virus sort of rip through the quote unquote healthy population. And that would be, and natural immunity would build up, and that's how we would reach herd immunity.
Well, I will say that from what I'm understanding from the medical experts I follow and the COVID journalists I follow, since repeated reinfection, it seems to absolutely destroy your immune system, it looks like that's a bad idea just on the science right off the bat now.
Well, it's also dangerous, right? Because natural immunity, even if natural immunity proves to be robust, you know, the research suggests that there is, at least for some time, some level of protection that prior infection does provide. But it's just dangerous to get infected with a virus that has potential long-term consequences, and can put you in a grave. You know, I mean, most people do recover from COVID, but for more than 1 million Americans, it's been a death sentence.
People like to say, the deniers, that COVID is like the flu. Okay. The Spanish flu was the biggest mass disabling event in world history up to that point. So Brownstone is one of those groups that's dedicated to those kinds of narratives. You know, Tucker founded Brownstone as the quote unquote spiritual child of the Great Barrington Declaration. And since its inception, it's become this hub for misinformation, including vaccine misinformation. It's become very prolific in that sense. And sorry, it is dangerous. Definitely. I mean, when you're advocating getting people sick, again, when you're comparing it to the flu, the Spanish flu was at that point in human history the biggest mass disabling event ever. Now, why does that matter? Well, you had a fascist movement in Italy and a Nazi movement in Germany and an America First movement in the US that were all saying, well, we can't afford to take care of these disabled people.
It's, you know, I have to say, pandemics have a way, or pandemics and social unrest generally, and economic downturns and all the stuff that causes confusion, fear, uncertainty, and can lead people to feel hopeless. All of those things foster the growth of fascism and fascist movements. And you know, we saw in Germany with, you know, the Great Depression helped facilitate the Nazi, you know, takeover, and it's bad. We're seeing it here. The pandemic has radicalized people, and Brownstone has been a point of radicalization. I believe has been a point of radicalization for people, and it has promoted this sort of idea, like, we're going to make public health officials pay for what they did. It promotes a conspiracy theory that
public health officials, the response to COVID was worse than the virus itself. And, Tucker published an article with a guillotine image at the top calling for consequences for public health officials.
I'm going to go. I'm going to take
radicalizing.
I'm going to take that in two chunks. The first chunk is that actually sounds like it's aimed towards gutting any sort of responsibility for anybody for failing to stop the actual COVID deaths, because it's focused on instead punishing people for the attempt to mitigate.
Well, that's certainly a part of it. I mean, the denial narrative, it's a little unclear to me. Like, do they blame COVID? I think they say COVID deaths aren't really COVID deaths, and that most of the deaths that are occurring are due to lockdowns, the vaccines, whatever you want to say that they're related to.
The Damar Hamlin is actually dead, and an actor was used at the playoff game to make it appear that he was alive, and the COVID vaccine killed him. No, I'm familiar with a lot of these, and they're disturbing in the extreme.
Brownstone doesn't outright say, COVID deaths aren't COVID deaths, but Brownstone does promote people who suggest that COVID deaths are overcounted, that we are undercounting deaths from the mitigation measures, particularly lockdowns. So, that's how Brownstone sort of skirts that.
They're also, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, they're one of the outlets who's very much big on the fact that nobody who dies was, quote, healthy, unquote. Everybody who died had some sort of comorbidity, and it's the comorbidity that's really to blame, not COVID.
That's a big denial narrative as well, that gets pushed out, that COVID is only killing people who would have died anyway, or were dying from other. They were on their way out, and therefore the response, the societal response, is inappropriate, because we are hurting people who would who don't unnecessarily. We're hurting healthy people who want to live their lives and live fulfilling lives.
This raises a thought for me. If they're really healthy people, aren't they less likely to be killed by lockdowns or vaccinations or wearing a mask than disabled people?
You can't apply logic to these claims. It's not. I mean, look, the narratives that Brownstone and other denial groups and denialists say, the narratives that they promote are counter to basically every major medical organization in the world. And they've suggested that the vaccines aren't safe, or that the vaccines should be, aren't safe for young people, that they should be restricted to just older folks. And I want to stress this effort to cast doubt on public health measures isn't just limited to the US. It's a global effort. And in Europe, they're seeing some success. In the UK, they're seeing some success. And that the mapping of the global,
this herd immunity, get all the healthy people sick and let it rip. That was Sweden before it was the US.
Well, Sweden, Anders Tegnell, the state epidemiologist, met with Sunetra Gupta, who was a co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, or would become a co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration. Talked about these herd immunity ideas. I mean, these ideas had been kicking around for a long time, or not a long time, because pandemic is only 3 years.
But I will say,
kicking around for some time.
They have been around for a long time. Maybe not in the exact form you're thinking of. However, in the 1980s, 2 representatives of Project Earth were invited on a local access public radio show to talk about the famine in Ethiopia. And the one dude said, yes, we have a clear strategy. The world will be best served if we let nature take its course.
Yeah.
Now,
so there is, and I know that Justin Feldman, who's a
a social epidemiologist with Harvard's FXB Center, or affiliated with Harvard's FXB Center now, is writing a book about how we can trace this kind of thinking back to the 1920s, eugenics, and
yes,
I mean, it's certainly, these ideas have been around for some time, but the idea of letting COVID specifically rip as a way to achieve herd immunity quickly and get everything back to normal, that was kicking around on the right for a while before it was articulated and given scientific veneer with the Great Barrington Declaration. That had existed on the right, and that exists not just in the U.S.
There was
but abroad as well.
I bring up 1918 again because there are so many parallels. There was a conscious decision in St. Louis in 1919 to end public health measures and let it rip. That saw massive deaths and disabling in St. Louis, Missouri, while other cities were still doing quarantines and suffered far less. So this isn't completely new. MSNBC talked about this early in the pandemic, comparing St. Louis to Philadelphia, and how they chose to adapt after the first year of quarantines was over. And you don't hear about this anymore, but they were talking about it a lot then.
Yeah, it's we can get to that. We can get to the reasons why we don't hear about the pandemic much anymore. But just to put a bow on Brownstone, they as an organization, we don't know who's funding them. I was not able to identify any donations from foundations, which is how, when you're searching money in politics, what you have to do is you have to pull tax returns for nonprofit groups, like 501c3 groups. They are required to disclose how they spend their money. And they're also required to disclose large donations that comprise more than 2% of their budget, yes, or their funding for that year. So you can see, like, oh, you can line up and see that way. But Brownstone doesn't appear to have gotten any funding from nonprofits, so it's possible that we'll learn more over the summer. But it's also possible that it's just corporations or individuals.
I remember your reporting on the Great Barrington Declaration, where it turned out a lot of the money was basically coming from Charles Koch.
So I don't want to say that the Great Barrington Declaration directly comes from Charles Koch, but I will point out that the focused protection as an idea, like limited protection only to the vulnerable, that idea was articulated in a Heritage Foundation reopening plan months before the Great Barrington Declaration was written. The group, the American Institute for Economic Research, the libertarian think tank that came up with the Great Barrington, or that published the Great Barrington Declaration, they've gotten funding from Charles Koch, nominal amounts in recent years. They're on sort of the edges of the network. But then the Great Barrington Declaration itself was written by one of the co-authors is a scholar at the Hoover Institution, which is a Koch-funded operation. And then, of course, Koch groups have given a platform to the authors and promoted the declaration. Like the Council for National Policy hosted Jay Bhattacharya, the Hoover Institution affiliated co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, at a conference. Like it's been promoted heavily by this by groups in Koch's orbit. So I don't want to say that the Great Barrington Declaration is directly from Koch, because I can't say that. But I can say that it comes out of that world and happens to provide an academic, in air quotes, academic cover to the policy agenda that Koch-backed organizations were promoting through the pandemic.
And this sort of brings me back to what I was saying about folks in the 80s. That idea of letting the famine take its course in Ethiopia of course is part of the idea that, you know, the world is overpopulated and there are just too many people, and it's the people that are creating the pollution. And if we get rid of the people, there will be less pollution and everything will get better. You saw some of the major networks sort of hinting in this direction themselves when they talked about how COVID had cleaned up the canals in Venice because people weren't going out and throwing trash into them. So all of a sudden the canals within a few weeks of shutdowns were clean.
I vaguely remember this.
And there was, so you have to, so this idea that people are the problem and we should not necessarily think of saving lives as the real response in crisis, as the real policy response to crises, because the natural response to the crisis might be better for humanity than actually saving people from the crisis itself.
I think there's another motivation here as well, and that is beyond that kind of thinking, and that is that crises like COVID, the response required, causes economic disruption. It's a change in how business, what it would take to live with COVID, the kind of response that it would take to actually live with this virus would mean more regulations on business, particularly workplace safety. It would mean a bigger social safety net. We saw in the pandemic how pandemic unemployment assistance, how the eviction moratorium, the debt repayment freeze, how all of those measures worked to get the stimulus checks work together to reduce poverty. And we know that economic circumstances, socioeconomic factors are a big determiner in how well you do with COVID, just generally. You know, we saw how the poor and working class communities were hit harder, disproportionately by this virus. And you know, that plays out along racial lines as well. We saw how communities of color were hit harder by this virus. So it's the kind of response that it would take to one, live with COVID, but also be prepared for the next pandemic. That's going to take some societal restructuring. And for the people that benefit from how society is structured today, for the corporations that really benefit, that's not a tolerable outcome. So there has been massive pushback from the business community on all sorts of COVID interventions. I mean, the vaccine or test mandate, you had the Chamber of Commerce and a whole lot of industries come out and say, you know, we don't want this. You had Coke back groups coming out in March 2020 saying, hey, we gotta sort of let states reopen here. These closures are bad.
You have things that people don't know about, like the film industry being given a total exception as an essential industry by Governor Gavin Newsom of California. And the reason that this is important is California is sometimes touted as a place where there was a good response. And you really have to point out that no, there wasn't. That things were worse in California than they had to be because of things like the film industry being given an exception. How many celebrities only died of COVID because the film industry got that exception and they were less safe at work than they should have been?
I mean, I have no idea, and I don't know how you'd pull those numbers, but yes, there has been at every level in the U.S. a concern for business. Now, obviously, you know, business and government function sort of hand in hand these days, and that's and to an extent always have. But I think particularly since Reagan, there's been a big focus on sort of measuring the success of the U.S. by how well business is doing. So to me, it's incredible that we even saw the relief that we saw. I mean, that was bigger than what we saw after the subprime mortgage crisis.
Like, it was necessary.
People? Come on.
And it wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough, but we have
people who have been
Gesundheit.
We have people who have been evicted since Biden's federal eviction ban lapsed, and who were being evicted before the ban lapsed because of loopholes. Let's not forget that. Simply because they lost their job due to COVID, and now they're homeless.
Yes. It's, look, the programs that they implemented, that the government implemented, the federal government, were not enough. Absolutely. The stimulus
but it's a miracle that we got that.
But it's a miracle that we got them, and their impact was tangible and direct and important. And it was the biggest expansion of the safety net that we've seen in decades. Like, that was significant, and there should have been.
It scared them so badly they let it go away immediately as first chance they got.
Well, a big part of that is the effort to downplay the pandemic, the effort that Brownstone has been a part of, that the Great Barrington Declaration was a part of.
Because social welfare expansion is not justified if the pandemic is not really a big deal.
That's exactly right, Chris. That is exactly right. If the pandemic is no longer the crisis that it was, if there is a tolerable level of death. You know, the height of the worst of the pandemic, we saw tens of thousands of deaths a week. You know, like during Omicron, I think between January and February, we saw something like 160,000 deaths. That was a staggering number of deaths. But today, during this wave, we've seen roughly 4,000 deaths per week.
Yeah.
So it's a lower amount, but this amount, the government says this is okay. They've done a lot of work to sort of acclimate people to this is fine. And groups like Brownstone have done their part in sowing doubt about the official numbers, about whether or not the crisis is actually a crisis or whether the response is the crisis. People are just, I think people are confused. They don't know. They don't trust experts. Even independent experts, and that's that's ideal for the political right that wants business to get what it wants.
I understand the reluctance. I really understand the reluctance to trust CNN and MSNBC. I really do. I'm not gonna lie. I understand everybody's reluctance to trust CNN and MSNBC. What I don't understand is why these same people then suddenly decide, but Fox, they're telling me the truth. I can trust them.
Right. Well, it's and you know, like, look, there are groups out there who are criticizing the CDC from the left, saying you haven't done enough to protect people. And I want to clarify something. The position that is the left-wing position is protect the most people, do the least harm. That is how I'm defining the left.
Sure.
What do you expect from your institution?
From a Marxist position, I'm not particularly Marxist myself, but I like Marxist definitions because they're so clear. From a Marxist position, the left should be concerned with protecting the essential workers who cannot be kept from doing their job and therefore cannot otherwise be completely safe, and their disabled friends and relatives who interact with them, who will be the traumatic loss that society suffers if the pandemic gets out of hand.
Right.
And that's basic. You protect the workers who have to work and the other most vulnerable people, because that's how you protect society.
You know, it stands out to me that these people who are like, oh, you're being misled by pharma, you're being misled by the you know, the people, the men in charge, the people in charge. Like, okay, let's just take a step back and talk about protecting essential workers. Like, what do you think needs to be? And they never talk about protecting essential workers. They don't talk about what it would, you know, because the idea, the narrative, it's sort of contradictory. On the one hand, the virus isn't a big deal, and it's the reaction is overblown. On the other hand, it's this engineered crisis by elites that, you know, and this great crime against humanity. How do you
and that raises another question.
workers.
Who are elites? Because Tucker Carlson is the heir to the Swanson fortune. Is he trying to tell me he's a working class dude?
I'm not sure if that's accurate.
His stepmother was the heir to the Swanson fortune. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I don't think he himself is the heir to the Swanson fortune. But yes, there are. I mean, look, when you have groups that are backed by one of the wealthiest men in the world saying we got to get everything back to normal and people just got to go back to work.
It's like when
you have the Chamber of Commerce saying it's time to get people back to work, you got to reopen the country. Like, that speaks to what elites in America want. The Chamber of Commerce is it's the preeminent business lobby association in America.
It's the boss lobby. So again, let's go with really specific Marxist definitions. The Chamber of Commerce is the boss lobby. By the Marxist definition, the Chamber of Commerce is the elite.
Yeah, so, if you find yourself on the same side as the Chamber of Commerce,
you're a bad Marxist.
You should reconsider your position if you think that you're pro-worker. I mean, the Chamber of Commerce doesn't care about workers.
I come from originally. I don't live there anymore because no one can afford to live there anymore unless they're already rich. But I come from Southern California originally. Shortly before I was born, there was a huge political kerfluffle in Southern California called Proposition 13. Proposition 13 was put together by two Republican activists, one of whom later became a libertarian activist, Paul Gann and Howard Jarvis. The Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association is one of the stalwarts of far-right politics to this day. That's who Howard Jarvis is. And Prop 13 is how he made his bones. Paul Gann, in one of the truly great, and I can't not be gleeful about this, I'm sorry. In one of the truly great examples of poetic justice in the 1980s, Paul Gann, who was a gung-ho Christian right-winger and racist and gay basher, caught AIDS from a blood transfusion. So, I mean, but the Howard Jarvis Association Taxpayer Association haunts us to this day. And they were pushing this idea, we need to lock down property tax rates in all of California to protect the rich, because otherwise black kids will get an education. And this would be a horrible threat to our status quo in the state of California.
These groups want fundamentally these right-wing groups, they want no taxes for wealth, and they want to strip down the government to just what it would take to protect that wealth. And a crisis like COVID creates an imperative to expand government, to help people, to protect people. The government needs to, in a pandemic, step up and do what it can to protect everyday people. So there is great incentive among these right-wing groups to find justifications for not doing that.
Yeah.
And there should have been, I would have liked to see mobilization on the left to make the kind of protections that we saw implemented permanent as a step. You know, like they were already put in place. Stimulus checks were put in place. Expanded unemployment assistance was put in place. There should have been, like, every left-wing group, every act should have been out, like, demanding that this stuff be made permanent.
And so here's where the great problem lies, in my opinion. You see this best illustrated whenever the topic of anything anti-war comes up. But we're not willing to do our own work. and by we, I mean as organizers and activists, a lot of people who claim they're pretty serious about building a workers' movement seem to want to tail either liberal groups like DSA and Democrats associated with DSA, or reactionary groups like the Libertarian Party, and not actually do any work themselves.
I mean, look, DSA would have been super useful in this fight.
But they made their leadership, and I hate to paint with too broad a brush because DSA is a lot of chapters and a lot of people. But the national,
and a lot of, I want to say, like, a lot of people who care a lot about, you know, what's going on and want to make a change. I just, when I critique, you know, left-wing groups, obviously I spare the lion's share of my critique for the far right, which is actively doing harm.
Yes.
You know,
well,
those are the groups that.
But this is where the critique is important, though, because nationally and on a state level in New York, and I believe a local level in New York City, DSA kind of made this decision to abjectly submit to Biden's lead on COVID policy, no matter what. We're not going to pressure them on this COVID stuff ending. It's not that important to us. We think we have higher priorities. Whatever those higher priorities are, I don't know, because what does DSA think is achievable if they can't even get basic public health stuff during a pandemic?
Let me put it this way. I think the critique of groups like DSA and other progressive organizations that kind of didn't prioritize COVID, in my opinion, prioritize COVID, is that they didn't adapt to the changing circumstances. That the left has its agenda, that you know, these groups have their agenda that they want to push. They want national health care. They, you know, they want certain policies, and under changed circumstances that didn't change. The pandemic added fuel to the we need Medicare for all, and I agree, absolutely, we need Medicare for all, and it does lend credibility to those arguments.
This is where I'm forced to drag myself off topic a little and delay the question about Jeffrey Tucker I want to ask a little longer to point out that they had already sacrificed Medicare for all as something that wasn't achievable. And they did so very early on by making statements like, well, no, we can get more out of the minimum wage if we don't make a big deal about Medicare for all. All of these conversations happened as a reason not to fight over Medicare for all when the whole force the vote conversation was coming up. Now, regardless of how you feel about force the vote or which side you think was right, there was clearly a decision made by a lot of people associated with DSA around the time that that discussion was being made. The Medicare for all was something they were willing to sacrifice for the future for quote unquote achievable goals now. So then you have no achievable goals that they got really instead of Medicare for all in 2020.
Right, but I mean,
well, I'm sorry,
it is worth noting though that Medicare for all wouldn't have happened. I
agreed with
the idea of holding up Pelosi's speakership
for
a set of demands. But
this is another really important but. The Republicans have shown us it works.
Right. Well,
more than that, the moderate Democrats showed us it works in 2020. The reason that the Democrats were on the progressive side were cozying up to Pelosi so hard is because they were desperately scared of this group of Kathleen Clark Democrats who were trying to hold up Pelosi's speakership on the right, and they thought that if they stood by Pelosi, they would stand something to gain from this. The problem is who gained from that? The Kathleen Clark type Democrats who are trying to hold Pelosi up.
I think it's, you know, look, I agree that whenever you have any kind of leverage, you should use it. But I hear,
arguments like, oh, focus on more attainable goals. In a way, that's sort of what I'm saying, that, you had these programs in place. You had expanded unemployment.
And this is where I'm going.
Should have fought for it to be permanent.
Let's say that COVID relief was the attainable goal for which we gave up all that other stuff. Because you can make a fair argument for that, and you just brought it up. And that's good. Because this is where I'm going. If COVID relief was really that attainable goal that was worth giving up all that other stuff, Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, what have you, then why are we giving up COVID relief, and what are we getting for it?
Right.
And that hasn't been sufficiently explained, in my opinion.
I think what has happened, and my sense of what's happened, is that COVID has become that the fact that progressives didn't fight harder on COVID relief, and now I credit to Cori Bush for her efforts to on the eviction moratorium, but the fact that there wasn't a more concerted effort by the American left to make permanent COVID relief and to really enshrine that allowed the right to take control of the narrative, to turn it into a culture war issue. COVID now has become a culture war issue, which I think has scared off everyone from progressives to moderate Democrats.
Which
you
makes
have
me
masking. You have the White House that won't even say you should wear a mask.
Let's remember, they were really the first time that COVID was over, when enough people were vaccinated that they were telling people not to mask during that little fake reprieve. People like Jill Biden were saying, doesn't it feel so good not to have to mask anymore?
Yes, and that was a huge political miscalculation, because the right response from the administration would have been to level with people about the state of the crisis.
Yes.
Look, this is ongoing. People are dying in numbers that we're not willing to accept. And there are also these emerging long-term, possibilities with COVID that we're a little concerned about. So we continue to recommend masking. They should have resisted industry pressure, particularly the airline industries. Yes. Remember the whole, you got to get rid of the travel mask mandate. They should have resisted that pressure more, and left-wing groups should have been out in force saying, we need these programs. This is essential. The crisis is still
that was the most obvious stupid idea. You see, during the so-called worst part of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, you see that people flying to visit their relatives during the holidays makes COVID worse.
Yes.
And then you listen to the airlines on COVID policy. I mean, let's take those two facts and try to reconcile them somehow.
Again, it's the concern for economic normalcy over social good. And I think that is, or conflating economic normalcy with social good.
Well, and really this is a good time. What is social good? So we have a system, the liberal system follows a utilitarian idea of social good that says the most happiness for the most people is good, and which is also based, even though it claims to be hard-headed and not unsentimental, which is also based on a Christianity that says, and when people die, they go to heaven. And so when you think of that in mind, and you understand the way that liberal utilitarianism considers moral hazard, and how important the idea that people need to go to heaven and we don't want to imperil their souls are, we forget that about our policy. We forget that our policy is based on the idea that we don't want to imperil the souls of the poor by making them less poor.
I mean, I don't want to speculate that, into the.
So this is not speculation. This is from Jeremy Bentham, who established the British welfare state.
I would say that there has been an idea that is pervasive among liberals and conservatives since the 1980s, that business, what is good for business, is good for society, and that and that the most good can come from the private sector, not the government.
And that
government is inefficient and badly run. And I think that,
it also comes back to this idea that you can't help people in terrible circumstances without making things worse for them. This comes from the economics of the same liberal period that started the utilitarian idea, where Thomas Malthus justified certain levels of deliberate cruelty because you couldn't make things better for the poor without making the rich poor too. Right. And that would make everybody poor and make things worse instead of better.
Right. Inequality is as a necessity to the continuation.
And this idea that we're all worse off if the rich are worse off is something that has to be wrestled with at some point, because it's not true. It's very much the opposite. The rich benefit greatly from our poverty. Our whole system of trickle-down economics involves stealing from the poor to make the rich richer on the idea that the rich will then pay the poor to do stuff for them.
Right. I think that, what I think happened, my overall, idea of how this pandemic went down is that wealth saw the New Deal and decided after the Great Depression, never again.
Exactly.
And decades of effort went into setting up institutional and systemic barriers to that kind of government action. And we are seeing that play out in real time. We are seeing the end result of those efforts play out in the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that it's been a huge blind spot for people to, when talking about this, to consider historical factors like what should a COVID response have looked like? What should government's response look like to a crisis like this, where, 1 million people have died? This is more than this. This is like climate change, but much more immediately felt.
So what did China and Vietnam do right that the U.S. did wrong? Let's ask it that baldly. What did China and Vietnam do right that the U.S. did wrong? And what happened when they changed their policy to reflect U.S. wishes?
I think that China's response to COVID, and this is an uncomfortable reality, I think, that China's response, they definitely had some horrendous overreach in certain, in places, but overall targeted lockdown, zero COVID. And you don't just see this in China. You saw this in New Zealand and in Australia as well. Targeted lockdowns,
Vietnam,
to combat the spread of the virus. A good idea. Getting people vaccinated quickly and while preventing the spread of the virus. Good policy.
You know where else you saw a China-level zero COVID response? Davos. They had a China-level zero COVID response at Davos for the World Economic Forum with all the billionaires there.
Absolutely. Look, that kind of protection that you saw at Davos, that should be extended to every workplace in America, every classroom in America. If the richest elites in the world get that kind of protection, you should get it too in your job.
The richest elites were willfully submitting to the same sort of things that the media that works for them called dystopian when talking about the Beijing Olympics.
They had, okay, let's go over it. They had air filtration. They had the windows were kept open. They had UV lights. And they had testing every day, bracelets to if you didn't test, you weren't getting in. People wore masks as well. Like this is
not just masks. They wore the masks they were supposed to wear and/or respirators, as opposed to just whatever masks they wanted.
This is, I don't understand how anybody can look at that and be like, yeah, no, it's overblown. We should,
because let's be honest. Under the circumstances right now, every essential worker should have a respirator, right?
I mean, Yeah. Or you know, at least in N95, like,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
like this is look, masks are, I want to say the fight over masks was a deliberately chosen fight by
Yeah.
these right-wing groups because it's
And
masking sucks. I hate
this
wearing a
is,
mask, but I do it because it
but
protects me and people around me.
it was chosen for another reason too, because sure, masking sucks, but also, and I hate to go to bad intentions here. I know you're going to say you're a journalist and you can't speculate. That's cool. This takes me back to Ethiopia and let nature take its course. There are people who believe we will benefit from the death count, and that is justified on a utilitarian level.
Again, you're right. I don't want to speculate to people's intent, but I will say that masking is a very outward symbol that the pandemic crisis, that the crisis is still going on. And there are a lot of reasons, I think because of that, and because it's uncomfortable or people don't like it, like it became a very easy thing for these groups to latch on to say, hey, we gotta, you know, and force the conversation around masking instead of the larger conversation about workplace safety measures, including indoor air quality standards, which if you don't want to wear a mask, like, this is just so basic. Like, yes, indoor air quality matters. You don't want to wear a mask? Let's make sure that the air that you're breathing at your job isn't going to infect you. And let's make your employer liable if they don't meet those standards.
But that's the whole thing. Employee liability is somehow an employer. My boss being liable is somehow an infringement of my employee rights. At least that's what I'm supposed to understand if I understand Jeffrey Tucker's argument, which is the perfect time, since we're talking about policy and history, and some people want people to die. Didn't Jeffrey Tucker used to edit a newsletter that Ron Paul was sending to most of the Republicans in Texas that turned out to be really, really racist?
Yes. So Jeffrey Tucker was an assistant to Lou Rockwell, who was the editor of Ron Paul's infamous newsletter, which came out, I think, during his 2008 presidential campaign, and dogged him again in 2012. That this newsletter was homophobic, it was racist. Rockwell was the editor, Tucker was an assistant. Both are speculated to have contributed writing to this. Tucker has not commented on it. I certainly, you know, I gave him an opportunity. I don't know if I asked him about that, but he was asked directly by Reason magazine about his role in that. He was not willing to speak on it. I think he said, look, I'll take credit for whatever my current job the content my current job puts out. So he's tied to this newsletter. He's also tied to a group called League of the South, which is a neo-Confederate group that he wrote for publications affiliated with League of the South. And he was listed according to an SPLC report from 2000. He was listed as a founding member of the group. So was Rockwell.
So basically, if somebody wanted to speak in very vulgar and non-specific terms that really cut right to the heart of who Jeffrey Tucker is, one could say, you know, Jeffrey Tucker kind of might be a Nazi.
I'm not going to say he's a Nazi.
Well, League of the South, I'm going to say
but I will say that Tucker is a creature of this far right, radical, extreme, you know.
So and this is where
he's also a veteran of Koch groups as well.
And this is where I talk about the fact that Bobby Kennedy Jr. has done very well from COVID denial. Bobby Kennedy Jr. himself was a speaker at what can safely be called a Nazi pro-eugenics rally, in which he made a reference to Anne Frank that suggested she was hiding because Hitler wanted to vaccinate her.
Oh.
And it should be noted that the Kennedys were Nazis in the 1930s, and Joseph Kennedy was asked to go home by the King of England because he was sharing private State Department documents sent for the UK Foreign Ministry with the Nazi German ambassador to the UK prior to sharing them with the British government like he was supposed to. So these aren't minor historical connections.
I think Tucker is sort of an anarcho-capitalist type.
Now,
he's drawn to these, I think he's drawn to anti-government groups. I think that his interest in COVID is again sort of what we talked about, that the business capital aligned groups don't want disruption to industry. They don't want the kind of government response that a crisis like this requires. And baked into that is it's okay that there are going to be these losses. Those losses are acceptable. And I don't think you can hide from that reality. I think that people should talk. We should talk about that there are acceptable losses to these business aligned people. And it probably doesn't hurt that those losses are coming from sectors of society that are not really their priority.
Well, what in the words of Charles Dickens, but Mr. Scrooge, some of them cannot go, and some of them would rather die. Well, if they would rather die, they had better do it and lower the surplus population. To which we are seeing in a real policy expansion of assisted suicide in Canada that now says you can get the government to help you kill yourself because you can't pay your rent. You still can't get enough help paying your rent from the government, but the government will help you kill yourself if you want to die because you can't pay your rent.
It's definitely, there are groups that government and business does not typically prioritize. Those who, poor and
those who
working class
cannot work
communities
because of disabilities come to mind right now.
Right. There's a willingness to sort of overlook the harms. And now there's sort of, Tucker would say that that of course he cares about those groups, and that's why he supports focused protection. But with an airborne pathogen, if you're letting it spread through the population, you're not protecting the vulnerable. No matter what you do, you're not. What you are doing is asking those groups to sacrifice, to make sacrifices for the good of everybody else.
Exactly.
When it should be the other way around. Everybody else should be making sacrifices for the vulnerable, for the people who are at risk.
I have a friend here in Oregon who cannot be vaccinated because of a medical condition. It's one of the few that you actually can't be vaccinated because of. She is the most gung-ho pro-vaccine mandate person I know, because she understands the principles of how vaccination works. If you can't be vaccinated, you need a wall of healthy vaccinated people between you and the virus.
Now, they would counter and say, well, the vaccines don't prevent transmission. They do.
That's why you need the wall of healthy people, though. That's the whole point.
Vaccination reduces transmission. It reduces your risk of severe illness and death. And that's important.
Exactly.
It is less effective against long COVID, although that's still evolving, where our understanding of it is evolving. But vaccination alone is not going to end the pandemic, but it is an essential tool. And anybody who tells you to be, like that the shots are more dangerous to you, unless you're talking to your primary care physician who knows your body and your conditions, anybody who tells you that, disregard. Talk to a doctor. Go out, talk to, if you can, talk to a doctor. But get vaccinated. It is one thing that you can do to protect yourself and others.
And this is where it's just such a, it's just
and
such
less
a
likely to
weird.
be hospitalized. Sorry to just interrupt. I just want to add this in. People, when they say, "Oh, the vaccine mandates, they don't prevent transmission, therefore there's no justification." Bullshit. Our hospitals have been overwhelmed through this pandemic. When waves hit, our hospitals inevitably get overwhelmed. Vaccinated people are less likely to be hospitalized. More vaccinated people, up to date with their vaccines, fewer people in the hospital. Disproportionately, the people in the hospitals and the people dying are unvaccinated.
Well, here in Oregon, they've prevented hospitals from being physically overwhelmed by physically keeping people out of hospitals and clinics as much as possible with virtual medicine of various kinds.
Well, that's
and I'm not saying that's bad, but what you have is you have this sort of, it's not any easier to see a doctor. And the reason it's not any easier to see a doctor is the doctors are still just as busy.
Right.
It's just the hospital does not appear to be physically overwhelmed because it's all happening on the virtual.
That is still better though, because you want,
of course,
fewer people in the confined space. But I hear you.
Still important to remember that when a hospital says we don't have a bed, they're not saying we don't have a physical bed we can put them in. They're saying we don't have the nurse and the medical assistant and the on-call physician available with the space to assign another patient to.
Right. And, look, I do want to say that the vaccine-only approach to COVID, vaccinated people can still end up in the hospital, and do still end up in the hospital. They can and do still die.
Colin Powell died and had all his shots and boosters at the time. And it happened because he had contact with other people still, despite the fact that he was tremendously vulnerable, even though he was vaccinated.
It's the solution to this pandemic. The solutions are so obviously multi-layered. It does come down, and we saw layered protection. Again, we've seen layered protection in action. We saw it at Davos. That's how you do it.
And this is where it comes down to. It's fine to say that Colin Powell or Herman Cain or one of the other members of the ruling class who's died of COVID has the right to make their personal choices. They're wealthy enough that they have the freedom to make their personal choices. I don't have the same freedom that the wealthy do in order to cut myself off from the rest of society if I choose to protect myself. My choice to protect myself is limited by what laws they allow to have passed.
Well, it would have been really beneficial to people to have, a stimulus check every month. That would have allowed people who are vulnerable to sort of to say, I'm not going to I'm not going to do this job that forces me to.
And essential workers honestly deserve the hazard pay, and the stimulus was the hazard pay,
stimulus checks, expanded unemployment assistance. Absolutely, hazard pay should have been a fight. That should have been a big fight in this pandemic. It hasn't been. I mean, there's still time. Every new wave, there's another opportunity to fight for these things.
Something happened early on. Something happened early on, and that is the Wall Street Chamber of Commerce Democrats realized, oh my gosh, these essential workers we're calling heroes, they're the same people who would benefit from raising the minimum wage. We better change something.
I think that there's an element of the Democratic Party that definitely doesn't. I mean, and this has been critiqued to hell, but I think there's an element in the Democratic Party that absolutely does not want the kind of change
at the very best. At the very best, if you want to be completely generous, at the very best, the Democratic Party does, and the various progressive groups within it do not have an understanding of how parliamentary power works, and or are afraid to use parliamentary power.
I think it's the latter. I think that there is a big fear that if they exercise power in a certain way, Ronald Reagan is going to come back to haunt them, and they're going to lose their control. And unfortunately, the opposite is true. If they don't, the
problem is, like you're saying, the opposite is true. Yeah, the very people that they're making promises to need to see them use their power in some way in order to feel like those promises are valid. Or
that government can even deliver conceptually, right? Like,
exactly.
People lose faith in government, and that is a serious risk. That is a risk to
the
democracy.
The only people who ever use parliamentary power are the people on both the Republican and the Democratic sides who say, no, this can't really work. The people who believe that it can work don't use any power.
Well, I think also there's a numbers issue, right? Like you don't have a very large progressive presence in government today.
Again, I think it all comes down to, are you afraid of using power because you're really afraid that it's somehow going to hurt you? Or are you afraid of using your power because you're afraid that Hakeem Jeffries won't like you? Because if you're afraid of using your power because you're afraid Hakeem Jeffries won't like you, I have a secret. Hakeem Jeffries already doesn't like you, and he's told you so.
I think that I think that the party is slowly changing. But I think that there is.
I feel like it's slowly becoming more like the Republicans.
I don't know about that. I've definitely felt that, for many years. But I think now the party is sort of wavering in terms of what direction it's going to go. You do have new young members who are coming in who talk about these big goals that they want to achieve, but you also have like a leadership that's.
When we're talking about young members who talk about goals they want to achieve, what are those young members willing to do to try to make those goals in any way achievable? Because it's not going to happen without friction.
Sure, but it's also not going to happen without the kind of, when the Tea Party wave happened in 2010, and you had a new class of like 87 new members of Tea Party members in Congress. So, there was weight behind those demands. I don't think there's not the same kind of weight right now.
But there is, and history matters. So in 1978, all the Democrats who were reelected or elected to office were for Medicare for all. All of them. In 1978. In 1979, Jimmy Carter specifically blocked Teddy Kennedy's Medicare for all legislation in such a way that all of those people lost their seats in 1980. And that's one historical example. Then you come along in 2018. Everybody who won their seat, even really awful people who didn't mean it, like Max Rose, said they were for Medicare for all. And yet all those people who won saying they were Medicare for all in 2018, who ended up actually being against Medicare for all once in office and ran for re-election as being against it and being against Bernie, they all lost. 2020 is when Nicole Maliotakis got elected in Staten Island.
Look, I think that there are
in 2018, even moderates were willing to pretend to be progressive to get elected. In 2020, all the moderates who abandoned their pretense of being progressive lost. And the lesson that the Biden people got from this was, well, we won. We're conservative. The voters want conservatives.
Well, right. But that's any time, that was inevitable, right? Like once Biden got elected, it was, this is what we want. Or this is what the people, they claimed a mandate. Now, I think Biden got elected in large part because of the pandemic.
That's the whole thing.
He promised to get the pandemic under control.
Biden got elected for two reasons. The first, in general, was COVID. The second specifically was Georgia. And the number one issue in Georgia during that election was police violence. Biden won Georgia because of the constant presence of George Floyd protesters everywhere in urban Georgia and even suburban Georgia.
I know, and
during that election
he hasn't delivered on either.
He did not deliver on either.
But I do think that the Bidens of the party, I mean, are getting old, and they're the younger people who are coming up.
How is Hakeem Jeffries different than Biden?
Hakeem Jeffries isn't, but the people who are getting elected are changing the makeup of Congress in a significant way. And I think that that's on a long, I don't know how long it's going to take, but the generational change in the party is, this is why I say it's sort of waffling. It doesn't really have a direction, because there are these competing factors. The party, on the one hand, you have young people with the energy, and they want a certain, I don't, and I think there's a lack of direction among those groups. We were talking about it earlier with the left. There isn't
the basic failure of the Congressional Progressive Caucus is that they aren't a functioning caucus.
Well, right. This is what we were talking about earlier, that there isn't this sort of cohesive demand for these tangible goals in the pandemic. But I do think that to sort of brush aside everything and say there's no battle, it's all over. I don't think that is accurate. I think there are people. I think that the party, definitely the people in charge of the party, are still very much in old school, and Hakeem Jeffries is a continuation of that.
How can they still be? And how can the younger people who support them still? Because I am old enough. I'm in my 40s. I am old enough to remember when Bill Clinton was telling liberal Democrats that we were doing this austerity thing because we were going to have a surplus. And that surplus would fund the American welfare state going into the 21st century. You remember what happened to that? I do.
Look, I think that there is a changing of the guard that is happening slowly. Pelosi's out. Hakeem Jeffries.
When it changes, is when the guard changes. Are the people who are supposedly representing the new party, the change, are they being changed too much in the time it takes the guard to change?
Look, I don't know. I do think that there are, if we had more Omars, Tlaibs, Ocasio-Cortezes in Congress, I think that there would be a much stronger push, much behind things like minimum wage.
We have, on paper, how many people are in the Progressive Caucus?
Well, the Progressive Caucus is the most inappropriately named caucus in Congress.
This is my point, though, because everybody in the Progressive Caucus is, in theory, committed to what Ilhan Omar or AOC are talking about.
Well, we know that that's not. We know that that's not.
We do. But, and this is a big but, in order to know to really know that that's not true, AOC or Ilhan would have to say something about it. But Ilhan can't, because she's the Progressive Caucus whip.
I think that it's.
Here's the question I would ask you then. Knowing Ilhan is Ilhan, and holding Ilhan to Ilhan's values as she would have us believe them to be, what does it say about the fact that she is the Progressive Caucus whip, and the Progressive Caucus cannot whip anyone?
I think that that's sort of a Sisyphean task, right?
So if that's the case, if that's really a Sisyphean
wait, Chris,
task,
let me finish. Let me finish. I think that it's a Sisyphean task because the extent to which money is so powerful and has infiltrated even the Democratic Party. I think
even the progressives.
But the Congressional Progressive Caucus, that is different from how many members of the squad are there? How many people are? We are talking about a handful of members that don't have institutional power.
So let me ask you a question.
Or the votes to wield it.
Let me ask you a question. I want to wrap soon, but this is one I want to ask. How much of the differentiation of the squad from the rest of the Congressional Progressive Caucus is real, and how much and how much of it is part of a publicity campaign. Look, specifically for these people.
I don't think you should take politicians, generally speaking, at their word. But when politicians tell you, I support X, you should hold them to that and make sure that they're
and then this brings us to the point.
Well, wait. I don't think that it's, I think that there are fair criticisms to be leveled against the squad. Absolutely. But I don't think it is a fair criticism to say that, that they are sort of responsible for the way things are shaping up now. They just are not a big enough.
I think that Jimmy Dore and people like that are wrong to single the squad out for individual personal criticism. I think that the legitimate criticism to be made is of the Congressional Progressive Caucus.
Sure.
And I think that as far as individual criticisms of members of the squad go, that the best faith criticisms of any individual congressperson in the Congressional Progressive Caucus is the general criticism of the caucus itself. And then the question, what are they doing about that, or are they part of it?
I think that it depends. I think it depends. My biggest criticism of, the squad and progressives, generally progressive organizations, all of it, is that they really, I think, have dropped the ball on COVID. Now, again, I acknowledge that they are dealing in a Congress that is largely dominated by politicians who adhere to big money interests, and there's a lot of pressure on these issues, and the White House certainly doesn't want COVID to be.
So here is my rhetorical question, and I think this is a good place to stop and end on the rhetorical question. You don't have to answer unless you really want to, but the rhetorical question is if there is really so much resistance to doing anything productive whatsoever through Congress, then should not the squad be adopting a political strategy that makes it more clear that nothing is possible and something has to change?
That is a tough question to answer, because I think that there is a concern among, and this is just me riffing, I haven't talked to anybody about this, but this would be my guess, is that there is a concern that comments like that will discourage people from taking part in elections. And now,
you know what? I think that ultimately comes back to everything, and I think what it comes down to is, if we tell people too much of the truth, they will not vote at all.
It's not even that it's too much of the truth. I think people inherently understand that Congress is a mess, because politicians adhere to, wealthy constituents' interests better than they do to regular people. I think everybody fundamentally understands that, but it is essential that the left doesn't give up on electoral politics, because that will seed the fight to the right. And things can always get worse. Absolutely. You want to talk outside strategies, inside, outside, whatever? Sure. That's a debate that can be had. But in terms of just voting against the monsters is, I think, a valid and worthwhile fight. And it will be harder for people who are in office who want to change if there aren't people like them getting elected every cycle.
Sometimes the most effective way of fighting a corrupt system is to fight the system and not participate in it. An excellent example of this is the African National Congress and some of the reasons that Nelson Mandela was in prison in the first place. I don't want to go too much into detail about it. I definitely encourage people to research anti-apartheid activism in South Africa.
Look, I just want to point out that as politics change, and they are changing, for the better, for the worse, politicians, even those you don't expect to be allies or enemies, can change very, very clearly. Like on an issue like hazard pay, you may find support among people that you wouldn't expect to get support from, or you might find opposition.
It's possible.
It not just possible, it happens. I mean, in real time. And I think that that's an element of politics that some of the left misses, that there is this, that politics isn't an all or nothing. It's not all or nothing based on one issue. It's there are fights that can be had where you might find, support where you didn't expect it. And that's,
but the question, the problem is that when people limit themselves to their concept of what is possible, they are proactively excluding everything else, whether it'll work or not.
Sure, but what we know isn't going to work is letting a bunch of Marjorie Taylor Greenes get elected into Congress. That's not going to deliver on anything.
But here's the thing: when Marjorie Taylor Greene being elected in Congress is actually probably of less serious import to most Americans than whether or not their state is passing a trans ban.
Well, sure, but that's a good example of, you got these Republican legislatures.
And this is where the breakdown happens. Where is the principled effort to actually change anything at the state level or the local level?
Well, this has been a big problem for Democrats, I think, for some time, and we saw in 2020 that when you see someone win strategy, but
when you see someone win at the state or the local level, DSA in Nevada, India Walton in Buffalo, then you see the establishment of the Democratic Party just reach out and take that win away because they control the money and physical tools of the institution.
I'm not going to say that the odds are not stacked heavily against progressive people in politics, but I will point out that, like, the consequences of this right wing winning can be far reaching. For example, Trump won, and in many ways in 2016, and in many ways that I think helped Democrats in 2018 and 2020. At the same time, Trump stacked the judiciary. Trump did real-time damage to people.
Of course.
And I think when it comes, when it comes to a progressive agenda, the judiciary being stacked by these radical right-wingers, that is a backstop against progressive action, it's removing the backstop from
right there in New York. Right there in New York, you see Kathy Hochul still not having completely 100% decided who she's going to go with now that her first choice for Supreme Court judge in the state, who's a right-winger that Trump might have appointed.
And you can find those examples of where establishment Democrats
but this is the problem.
Empower the right. And I'm not gonna argue that.
It's not that this is some odd example. No, I live in Oregon. The mayor of Portland is a Democrat. Republicans are in no danger of controlling Oregon anytime in the near future. The politicians in charge are Democratic. We have a right-wing, pro-cop, anti-protester, gung-ho, pro-business state without any Republicans in real power.
Right. I'm not going to say that the centrist Democrats are not empowering, you know, business, and they're not facilitating, they're not helping the political right in the sense
they're becoming
agenda.
a haven.
But I will point out to you
rehabilitate those on the political right who don't like Trump.
But
we're even seeing Marxists.
Okay, but Chris, they're not appointing Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court.
Not yet. Not yet. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. We have a system whereby if Joe Biden thought it would win him more votes to appoint Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, he would seriously consider doing it.
But he's not doing it. And that is a tangible difference. Justice Jackson is light years better than Barrett, than any of Trump's appointees.
What's happening at the circuit level? We're still, Obama and Biden have confirmed a lot of federal judges who aren't that far from Trump judges.
Some of those picks have been bad, absolutely, but I would say that a majority of the picks are not. It's still absolutely preferable to have even a centrist, like I would say a more right-wing Democrat like Biden picking court judges and justices than it would be for a far right, you know, Federalist Society. The Federalist Society grooms Republican.
Well, the Federalist Society
judges.
The Federalist Society is literally part of the passive eugenics movement that I was talking about before. They're heavily tied in to very specific legal principles that make people like Charles Koch very happy, whether he's behind them or not.
Right. This is and that's
various people connected to the Federalist Society were mentored by John Tanton, who came from the population control environmental movement to found an anti-immigration movement.
But we don't have the kind, and I think there's a lot of frustration on the left that there isn't a counterweight to this. But
here's the thing.
The money is not on our side, right?
First,
this is part of the problem.
The first part of the problem is what you're saying about genuinely how bad the Republicans are. In my coarse, vulgar, non-specific language, I would say that problem number one is that the Republicans are Nazis. And problem number two is that the Democrats are the party of good government, reasonable compromise, and bipartisanship,
and they don't live
Nazis.
Look, we obviously have it's a bad place. The country is in a bad place. I
fight Democrats because I don't want to fight Republicans. I fight Democrats because they don't fight Republicans.
And I'm not saying don't oppose corporate Democrats. I'm not saying that, but I am pointing out that like there is a world of difference between somebody like Biden and somebody like Trump in terms of far-reaching consequences. Now, Biden's pandemic response, absolutely, I won't defend it. It's been a disaster.
Here's where it gets dangerous, though, and this is where I'm not making my argument. I'm not making this argument myself, but this is where you see the populist sort of we need to try to find common ground with good Republicans argument comes in. Let's go ahead. Let's take the most awful person you can think of who's ever legitimately been right about anything. Mike Lee and Matt Gaetz both supported all of Bernie Sanders' initiatives to end the war in Yemen. Matt Gaetz helped Ro Khanna with all the House versions, and Mike Lee was gung-ho behind Bernie Sanders' Senate version. Are Matt Gaetz and Mike Lee someone that you could find any common ground with on any other issue?
No.
They're part of they themselves are the Nazis. They've supported that one good thing out of the blue for whatever reason, but they themselves are the Nazis. So you take a corporate Democrat. Best example I can think of is Adam Schiff, simply because if he's challenged in the primary again, it will be by maybe a girl, and she is much better than him and should win. But anyway, Adam Schiff, who's also going to run for Senate, that's a nightmare. But Adam Schiff is not different from Matt Gaetz on a series of corporate and foreign policy positions regarding China and workers' rights and a bunch of other things. But Matt Gaetz is more likely to vote for peace in Yemen than Adam Schiff is. Does that mean that Matt Gaetz is really better than Adam Schiff? No. But it does make it really hard for people to argue that Adam Schiff is really better than Matt Gaetz.
I don't know about that.
I'm not saying that this argument is correct. I'm saying you cannot fail to consider these things. If you fail to consider these things at all, then you end up walking right into this bad faith trap. That's really the same argument the Democrats make for compromising with the Nazis in the first place.
I don't think, look, I think that there's some conflating going on. I think that when you say that Democrats are the party of good governance with Nazis, I think that I think that that's an inevitable consequence of the fact that the Republican Party has just become a fascist party. Good government meaning, that's the thing. Well, wait. But good government meaning that, hang on.
Shouldn't the Liberal Party be anti-Nazi?
Sure, but it also isn't it's also not defaulting on debt. It's keeping the lights on in public schools and in federal workplaces. It's, good government meaning like government functioning, sure. And in order to do that, you have to, I'm just saying, like, they're not out there like, yeah, we also have to ban like trans people and
but that's the thing.
That's not,
you have
and those are tangible differences, though. Those are big tangible differences.
You have lots of Democrats, and to be fair, you also have lots of leftists who say they don't want to compromise with Democrats. I'm not going to take them out of their share of blame. But you have lots of people, Democrats, anti-Democrats, who are literally saying we got to compromise with these people who hate queer folks because they're the ones who are anti-war and for Medicare for all.
Well, look, there's a difference between getting somebody's vote on one particular measure and sacrificing sacrificing groups of people for some kind of alliance. Like,
this is where it starts to get tricky, because the Democrats,
what?
And by Democrats, I mean the National Democratic Party that's fought in court to say that it's not responsible to its own voters. The Democratic Party as an institution doesn't want to be changed.
No, of course not. And there are obstacles to that.
It is built and funded by a system of telemarketing to millionaires.
Sure, but what is the alternative vehicle? I'm open to alternatives, absolutely. But
the alternative
what is the alternative vehicle? You can't.
The alternative vehicle is to actually build something that genuinely represents our interests.
Yeah, but
that involves losing a lot, but we're not winning now.
But when that happens, you get groups like the People's Party, which are.
But so this is the thing. The People's Party aren't trying to build anything.
Right, exactly.
The People's Party are just a grift designed to stop people from building things.
Right.
They are a front.
A lot of this stuff, the tearing down of like, oh, the experiment has failed because AOC and the squad disagree on this or that.
So I'm gonna go to historical context. We really need to wrap up. But
yes, we do.
I'm gonna go to.
We'll do this again.
Yes, I'm going to go to the historical context here before we wrap up. Everything we're talking about now is an argument that a dedicated Marxist and a member of what was then DSOC, it wasn't DSA yet, it was DSOC. This is the exact argument that people were having in 1978. And it still hasn't significant, and the level of support by the leaders of the party is still hugely behind the level of support for this policy from the voters of the party. Nothing has changed in this regard since 1978.
Well, remember that what happened in 1980.
But here's the most depressing part. If anything, support for Medicare for all is probably a little less now than it was in 1978.
I don't know about that. Maybe
the highest number across both parties is like 72%. In 1978, it was like 80% because that was when you still had Republicans who were going to vote for it.
That you're talking about electeds?
I'm talking about voting level people. That was when you still had Republicans who were voting for Republicans who were going to vote for something like Medicare for all. I mean
that might be
example.
True.
Paul Tsongas became a senator in Massachusetts by defeating Edward Brooke, who was a guaranteed yes vote on things like that. Who was a Republican.
I think that we have to factor in that in 1980, Reagan won in a landslide, and paradigm shifted.
You have to figure in that part of the reason that happened is because of the fact that in 1978, the national leadership of the Democratic Party, then as now, had more in common with Reagan than their own voters.
I think that the reason that Reagan got elected there's a lot of reasons, but stagflation is a big one. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system, you had, and also just the backlash, I think, to a lot of the civil rights gains of the previous decade.
That backlash is called neoconservatism, and it was a creature of the Democratic Party. The neoconservatives were people like D.P. Moynihan and Scoop Jackson. They were not Reagan Republicans. They were Reagan Democrats.
You had a realignment of white moderate voters,
yes,
Southern white moderate voters under Reagan. And a lot of that was a backlash to the civil rights program that we had seen in the 1960s and the
because racists made the decision. Racists made the specific decision to go from being pro-abortion from a pro-eugenics standpoint to being anti-abortion from this will get the Catholic racists on our side standpoint.
Well, Carter was the one who mobilized the evangelicals in the first place.
Yes,
but then Reagan capitalized on it. That's when you see an emergence of the modern conservative, or what was the up until I think the conservative movement recently has changed. This sort of traditional alliances, they're still there, but it's shifting. I think it's becoming much more radical.
Yeah.
But you saw the unholy alliance between religious zealotry, racism, and capital.
See, now this is where, and I'm going to just stop us right here. This is where in the future we need to do a whole show about how the religious right came to be and how Barry Goldwater saved Roe v. Wade.
Let's do it.
And for now, thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate it. Is there anything you want to plug before I shut off the recording?
I got a fun story coming out this week in my newsletter, or out this week in my newsletter. So subscribe. It's important context. It's on Substack, and download the opt-out app.
And I will say, without any spoilers, NDAs are bad, people. People should not be People should not be signing non-disclosure agreements with their employees. People should not be forcing their employees to accept binding arbitration to work for them. On that note, I hope everybody has a great night.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thanks, Walker. Bye.